the word thaws there implies that I got to plug in, don't I? Hang on a second. I got 19 things to plug in just to get started. Okay, there we go. Cold War thaws. So the idea here is, what the title is, the Cold War. Think about when the Cold War was its coldest. It was so cold it was frozen. It's kind of a way of thinking of that. Well, it's going to go from being so cold that it's frozen to thawing out a bit, warming up, you might say, a little bit. So what we're going to be doing here is talking about the story of how the Cold War ended. Now, it's going to take a long time. The thaw will unfold over the course of decades. But there is a thaw, a long, slow warming up of relations between the United States and the Soviet Union. A long, slow end to the Cold War, in other words. So what I want to begin with today is looking at Soviet policy. Like, what are the Soviets doing in this era as the Cold War thaws, in particular in Eastern Europe and in China, and hopefully we can kind of understand why this happened. So first of all, we need to talk about de-Stalinization. So the word de-Stalinization that you see on your outline there refers to making things less the way that Stalin would have had them. That's what the Stalinization and de-Stalinization means. It's sort of going in a different direction than Stalin had taken Russia, right? Stalin was a murdering psychopath, right? A totalitarian dictator. He was a real special kitten, was Stalin. And he kind of wore out the Russian people, especially with all the murdering. Okay, that was quite unpleasant, even for the Russian people who went along with it. So there's a sense in which Russia's going to back off that as a policy. Okay, they're going to de-Stalinize. And that can only begin, though, when Stalin's out of the way, which happened in 1953. Stalin died in 1953. And he was replaced by the new premier. That's what they called the leader of the Communist Party in Russia, was called the premier. The new premier, you know, is Nikita Khrushchev. Okay. So Nikita Khrushchev takes power starting in 1953. Bigger. There we go. And Russia goes in a different direction. Khrushchev wanted, as I was just kind of indicating, wanted to remove the influence of the murderous Stalin on Soviet society. Okay, he's going to intentionally take Russia in a different direction. So theoretically, Russia is going to become a little less communist, maybe a little more liberal, a little bit more Western. But this is a little bit deceptive because the Soviet Union appeared to be less totalitarian, less heavy-handed, less abusive of its people, more open to free market ways, but appearances were deceiving. Okay, this is really kind of only on the surface. So the Soviet Union only becomes a teeny tiny little bit less extreme in their ways. Take, for example, the 1956 rebellion in Hungary. In Hungary, if you look on the map up here, Hungary, you should know, right here, right next to Austria. Hungary is the Eastern European communist country of Hungary. In 1956, rebels inside Hungary tried to overthrow the communist government. Okay, they tried to enact a coup. A coup is an overthrow. Try to get rid of the communists in Hungary. But Khrushchev, because he's the Soviet dictator, the Soviet premier, he's not having it. And the Russians sent in their military into Hungary, and they brutally crushed this rebellion. So while we are saying that the Soviets maybe start to soften a little bit de-Stalinization in 53, not much, right? They're still brutal, they're still heavy-handed, they're still willing to send the military into a country and kill a bunch of people to make them continue to be communist. Okay? But there is the very beginning of a process of them warming up just a little bit. Okay, so let's turn our attention to Czechoslovakia to further reinforce this point. In 1962, Nikita Khrushchev was replaced. Okay. Actually, there were a lot of hardcore communists who thought that Khrushchev was too soft. They didn't like this idea of softening Russia. So they replaced him with a new guy named Leonid Brezhnev. Love those Russian names. Leonid Brezhnev. So let me show you some pictures here too. We've got first Khrushchev. There's Mao. I showed you Mao, right? Okay. Kennedy, Castro. This is from the other day. Khrushchev. Looks like a kindly old grandpa. Looks are deceiving. That's Khrushchev. That's Nikita Khrushchev. And he was replaced in 1962 by Leonid Brezhnev. I love the reaction. That's everybody's reaction. How'd you like to have a face like that? Where people see your face and their first reaction is, oh. Yeah, that's actually good. Yeah, the eyebrows. They look like they're about to take over his face.
That's a real picture?
Oh yeah, that's him. What's the alternative?
They could have edited or filmed it. I don't know.
Yeah, I guess. Why would they? Yeah, that's him. He's got famous eyebrows. And he's a tough guy, okay? Remember, they thought Khrushchev was a little too soft, so the leaders in communism, the high-ranking people, the military, they want someone who's more tough and more of a hard man. And Brezhnev is like that. He's a little bit more like Stalin, Brezhnev is. So you see this with the way he behaves. Yeah.
Okay, so you know how you said the government or something say he's getting too soft?
Uh-huh.
Like, what if, they like killing people? And
Yeah. It's crazy. They like power. They like to control the Russian citizens. Yeah. They believe that's the only way to continue to be communists. That if you let up at all, that the communists are going to lose power. Yeah, I mean, you actually asked exactly the right question, and it's kind of crazy, and it's important to think about that. You've nailed it. It's an ugly thought, but it's absolutely true. So Brezhnev is a tough guy. He clamped down on dissent. You know what the word dissent means? Disagreement. Stating your opinion, right? Communist countries don't go for that. You're not free. They don't have individual liberty, right? You're not free to say what you want, which is what makes it such a totalitarian society, an unfree society, is things like the lack of free speech. So if anybody says anything, Brezhnev starts to clamp down on it, crack down on it. In the Soviet Union, you understand that means you go to prison, you go to a labor camp in Siberia, you get shot in the back of the head. Okay, that's what clamp down means. This is true both in the Soviet Union, inside Russia, and in Eastern Europe. Dissent was clamped down on. For example, in Czechoslovakia, you had this emerging political leader in Czechoslovakia named Alexander Dubček. I believe he's in the book. No, I can't remember. Anyway, Alexander Dubček. So he was the Czech leader. So Czech is what you call people who are from Czechoslovakia. America, American, Czechoslovakia, Czech. So Czech, he's the Czech leader. Dubček was. He's the ruler of Czechoslovakia. Dubček starts to introduce some reforms, makes some changes to communist Czechoslovakia to make it less evil, less totalitarian, less murderous and violent. Thawing a little bit in Czechoslovakia. But Brezhnev is not having that. Okay? The Soviets are clamping down. By the way, this movement for greater freedom and reform in Czechoslovakia was called the Prague Spring. Prague is the capital of Czechoslovakia. So it's as if in Czechoslovakia there's a lot of positive feeling where the Czech people are thinking, well, think about what spring is like. What's spring like? What do we associate with spring? The season, I mean.
Rain.
Okay, yeah, rain, but rain brings growth, flowers, and warmer temperatures, and green, and new life, and all that kind of rebirth, and that kind of sense. So there's a feeling a really kind of emerging, happy, positive feeling in Czechoslovakia that things are going to be better, that it's not going to be like the bad old times. Well, Brezhnev sweeps in August of 1968. August 1968, and clamps down. The Soviets invaded Czechoslovakia. Dubček was removed from power. The reforms were stopped. Okay, so you see what I mean by, I guess it's like a block of ice, right? Where when thawing happens, it happens slowly. You can see clearly that it's thawing, but it doesn't turn into liquid overnight. It takes a long time. So thawing is occurring, softening, or you might say the Soviet system is actually cracking up. It's starting to break down over time. But the Russians are fighting it every step of the way. Meanwhile, in the East, you see a split between the Soviet Union and the Chinese. Okay, you know the Chinese have become communist, right, with their ruler Mao and their murdering ways, just like the Russians. But you start to see a split between those two. Right? Those are two really important powers, right? The two major communist powers in the world, who, if they want to continue to win to fight the Cold War, they need to stay close together. They need to be buddies. They need to have a strong alliance. They need to work together. But over time, they're starting to split. By 1960, Soviet and Chinese relations had weakened. By 1960, you really see the two begin to drift apart. That is, the Soviet Union and the Chinese. Going all the way back to 1949, when China became communist, when the communists won the Civil War in China, the revolution, the Soviet Union had always expected China to recognize the leadership of the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union, in other words, always viewed China as kind of a little brother, you might say, right? Saw them as secondary in the hierarchy, right? Soviet Union at the very top, and then next down is China in the ladder, in a way, of communism. The Chinese were never comfortable with this, right? The Chinese are a very old civilization. They're huge, they're important, they're proud. They always thought, who do you think you are, right? Yeah, we're communists too, but we're not playing second fiddle to you. So by 1960, that had always been there, going all the way back to the beginning. But by 60, it really starts to show. And the two sides stopped cooperating closely. China's behaving in a more and more independent way. And as we said, the Soviet Union is showing signs of weakening, of cracking up a little bit, even though they're trying real hard to hold on to power. So you have an interesting development there, where the two major powers on that side in the Cold War aren't getting along exactly. All right. So then, détente. Let's shift gears here. Détente. This is a French term, obviously. And détente describes a policy of lessening Cold War tension. That's all it means. It's really simple. Détente. Trying to ease tensions. It's a policy of making attempts to play nice with the Soviet Union in the Cold War. Now, it doesn't mean becoming allies and friends. Okay, détente doesn't mean the United States and the Soviet Union are all of a sudden going to hug and hold hands and sing Kumbaya and be BFFs. That's not what we're talking about. It's just, let's be a little less hateful towards each other. Just a little bit. That's what détente means. Okay, and it starts in 1969, and it comes from the American president, Richard Nixon. There's a picture of Nixon. So Richard Nixon, as President of the United States, starting in 1969, replaces America's policy and starts to say, let's just figure out a way to get along a little bit better with the Soviet Union. In particular, he was following a philosophy, a foreign policy philosophy called Realpolitik. This is a German term, Realpolitik. And it's easy to remember what it means because it's kind of right there in the term. You can see the English words. Real politics, realistic politics. Instead of idealistic politics, it's realistic politics. Realpolitik in the Cold War context would mean something like Nixon saying, okay, look, the Soviet Union is evil. They are our enemies. They're dangerous. If they could, they'd kill millions of us with nuclear bombs. That's the reality, right? So let's deal with the reality and try to avoid that situation. Okay, let's talk to them, for example. At least have some communication. Just be realistic. That's what that means. And so that meant détente. That means trying to ease tensions. And the thing is, that's interesting, is that the Soviet Union agreed, at least to some extent. They began to also pursue détente. The two sides began to talk to each other about what can we do to prevent a future nuclear war, right? We saw how close it got. Okay, what was that called, that incident where things almost blew up in the world? It was in Cuba. It was in the Cuban Missile Crisis, okay? So that still looms in people's minds, right? Because we're still talking about 1969 here. Remember, that was 1961. That was only 5 years, 7 years earlier than this. So there's still a sense of, hey, that was a really scary thing. Both sides, what can we do to prevent that from happening? So both sides are open to talking to each other just a little bit, whereas they hadn't been open at all before that. You see this also with China. Nixon, this president, also wants to change the way that the United States interacts with China, another communist Cold War enemy. And so Nixon pursues this policy there. In fact, Nixon was the first U.S. president to visit communist China. The very first, since 1949. The very first, the one and only president up to that point, who had visited communist China. And he did so in February of 1972. This was a really big deal. When Nixon went to China, it signaled a big change. People around the world, in China and in the United States and the Soviet Union and Western Europe and everywhere else, thought, well, okay, now that's different. That's new. That has never happened before. Nixon's really serious about trying to improve relations with the Soviet Union. This is détente, this visit to China. And along with this, you see the United States beginning to view China as a third superpower. Okay? So most of the Cold War, the way we think of the Cold War normally is, and I keep saying this, right? There's two superpowers. U.S., Soviet Union. Soviet Union, U.S. They sometimes call it a bipolar world. You know what bipolar means in kind of a psychological context, but two poles, right? The Earth has two poles, North Pole, South Pole. It's like politically the world had two poles, Soviet Union, United States, and the world spins on that axis. Well, more and more the United States in the 70s starts to view China as a third superpower. So it's not just U.S. and the Soviet Union, it's U.S., Soviet Union, and China. And so that changes how America looks at things. This is a part of détente and realpolitik. Okay. Questions about that? Nice and easy, short lecture. I told you these would be short